At the conclusion of a war, the victors are elated and the losers are discouraged. But for both, there's another attitude. What comes next? What happens now? For Abram, after his successful war against the 4 Confederate Mesopotamian kings, it is progress in the covenant of grace, which is recorded here for our benefit. Let's look first at the setting of this covenant progress in verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward." We note here first the time of this covenant progress. After these things. After a remarkable victory won against these much more powerful foreign kings. After a rescue of Abram's nephew Lot and other people and possessions. After a return from the victory which occurred almost 200 miles to the north. Abram, you see, had more to learn from these experiences. A reminder that God brings experiences in our lives precisely so that we might learn from them. And yet, do we? In the Epistle to the Hebrews, the author writes to his readers, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food." We need to move from milk to meat. Then we note the means of this covenant progress in verse 1b. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying. The means here are divine. It is the Lord who came. It is a sovereign means, for he came to Abram. It was not Abram who sought him out. It is a personal means, because God came, we read, to Abram. And it was an extraordinary means, because he came to him in what is translated here as a vision. It is the 5th communication of God with Abram, but the first of only 3 times in the whole of the Old Testament that this particular Hebrew word is used. It also appears in Numbers 24 and Ezekiel 13, and in each case it is translated as vision. Whatever it is precisely, it seems to be a divinely induced state where God is able to communicate more adequately than normal. It is not a dream. Now, Abraham did not expect or even demand this vision, but he heard him out. For when God speaks, we are to listen, to heed, and to obey. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 27, Moses says to the people, "You go near and hear all that the Lord your God may say, and tell us all that the Lord our God says to you, and we will hear and do it." Covenant progress is also the setting of a prompting in verse 1c. "Do not be afraid, Abram." We do not read that Abram was afraid, but he must have been. For God knew Abram, as he does all of his people, and knows that he is afraid. But of what? Most likely it's fear of the return of the 4 Mesopotamian kings, angered by his success in warfare and eager to once again claim the booty in people and possessions. But it may also have been fear of opposition from the Canaanites who surrounded where he was living in the middle of the Promised Land. Despite the fact, as we saw last time, that King Melchizedek of Salem was priest of the Most High God and therefore friendly to Abram. God knew Abram's fears, and God knows your fears as well. And directly or indirectly will meet them. And he does so preeminently in the person of his Son, Jesus. In Matthew 8:26, on a boisterous sea, Jesus said to his disciples, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. This was not simply a magician's act, producing something we didn't expect, but it was a reminder that Jesus is there to meet our fears and provide a peace in our hearts. In its setting, covenant progress also involves encouragements. Verse 1d, I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward. There are twin encouragements here. The encouragement of protection. The shield was taken into battle. Very appropriate language just after Abram had participated in a great battle. To protect the soldier from the arrows of the enemy. And God doesn't say, I will provide you a shield. He says, I am the shield. There's a difference there, isn't there? That means that you, like Abram, are as safe as God can make you. That's why Psalm 46 begins so triumphantly. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And whether the wars that are waged against us are spiritual wars or physical wars, nonetheless, He is our shield, making us safe. But He's also, we read here, and this is the twin encouragement, He provides the encouragement of satisfaction, your exceedingly great reward. Everything about God is great because of the kind of being He is. God is exceedingly better than the spoils that Abram gave up, as we saw last time in chapter 14. And so in Romans 4:17, that extended commentary on this passage and one or two others, we read, as it is written, I have made you a father of many nations, in the presence of him whom he believed, God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. Abram received so much from the Lord, and that more than made up for what he left behind of the loot. For God made him satisfied with what he had because he had God, and that was enough. So that's the setting of the covenant progress that we see here. We turn next to its challenge, verses 2 and 3. But Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Then Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. Yet after learning of his covenantal protection and reward in the being of God himself, Abram is bold to ask for more. God gave Abram an opportunity to express any thoughts which were still troubling him before revealing more promises which would give him even more comfort and hope. And so there are four aspects to the challenge that Abram brings to God. The first is Abram had no child. And because he had no child, it was impossible for him to implement the command of Genesis 1, verse 28a. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." Abram and Sarai were not. Abram had no child, and so he was not preserving the covenant line that was announced by God in Genesis 3:15. "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Abram had no child, not advancing God's rule over the earth. Returning to Genesis 1:28, the second half of the verse, "Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." That requires children, lots of them. Abram had no child, not creating a great nation. That was one of the initial promises to him when he was called out of Ur of the Chaldees to take possession of the promised land, he and his seed after him. "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great." Infertility on any number of levels is a burden on many couples. In our congregation in Pittsburgh, there were just a congregation of 50 people, and there were two different young couples who struggled with infertility. And we need to be sensitive to them when they have no child. This is a burden to many couples. But it was particularly a burden on Abram because of the promises that God had given him about a child, about a son, about a seed. And so the second aspect of the challenge here is that Abram had no likelihood of a child. We know that Sarai was postmenopausal. It was impossible for her to have a baby. Abram was too old. He was pushing 100. Now, it's true that Senator Strom Thurmond, when he was aged 74, fathered a child with his wife. But Abram is still well beyond that age. He had no likelihood of a child. A third aspect of the challenge is that Abram had a servant as an heir. We even know his name, Eliezer of Damascus. This servant would then likely have been a pagan who was from the city of Damascus, one of the oldest cities in the world. And he, for unknown reasons, was the heir of Abram. Was he the longest serving heir? Was he the longest serving servant? Was he the oldest servant? Was he a convert to the faith of Abram and therefore was chosen to be his heir? We don't know. But note that this man who is a servant can be, in Abram's mind, his heir. Heir to his property, heir to his family name, heir to everything that he leaves behind. And this is a reminder that being an heir can be based on something other than physical procreation. Romans 8, verses 16 and 17. Paul, the apostle, writes, The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirits, or with our spirit, that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. There it is. Abram had a servant as heir. But he was not aware of the fact that it was not simply a physical heir that God was going to provide, but many spiritual heirs. Abram had much to learn about God's covenant, and so do we. The fourth and final aspect of the challenge is that Abram had no joy in the covenant. Abram was asking himself, obviously, have I been wrong about this Lord? Should I have simply remained in Ur of the Chaldees? Should I trust him with these promises? Years have passed, and they're not being implemented. And the key is that I'm childless, and all the other things depend upon that, and I have no child. More than that, he has no property in the promised land. He's lived there, but he has not taken possession. We know that because years later he has to buy land in the promised land to bury Sarai, later named Sarah, when she died before he did. In other words, God's promises in the covenant of grace seemed empty. The encouragements of verse 1 seemed inadequate. And so, like Oliver Twist, he says, God, I want more. More. And God, in his love and patience, provides it. So we turn, thirdly, in the progress of the covenant of grace, to its promises in verses 4 and 5. These promises come first in a statement in verse 4. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. The word behold is there specifically to say this is important. The Old Testament uses behold before something important, and Selah, especially in the Psalms, after something that's really important. God is providing here an additional communication with Abram. What was its form? We don't know. We don't read of a dream. We don't read of a vision. We read simply that the word of the Lord came to him. Eleazar of Damascus will not be your heir. Rather, it will be one, in rather more colorful language than our usual English translations, from your loins. And how often God stops us when we start complaining, doesn't he? As God does here of Abram, and says, no, this is my promise. You are going to have an heir. You have to wait for him. God will accomplish his covenantal purposes in Abram and through Abram. But you have to learn to wait. Have you ever noticed as you sing the Psalms how often they say to wait? Typical is Psalm 25 and verse 5. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. On you I wait all the day. Debbie Dortzbach was an Orthodox Presbyterian medical missionary in Eritrea in the 1970s. She was kidnapped from the hospital where she served, even though she was some months pregnant. And she was kept for several months by her kidnappers. Ironically, even though they were Muslims and communists, they did not molest her, sexually molest her at all, because she was pregnant. And in the book that she wrote, entitled Kidnapped, not the Robert Louis Stevenson Kidnapped, but a different one, she writes that the hardest thing for her was to wait. It wasn't the fear that she might be attacked or killed. It wasn't the fear that they wouldn't feed her or provide drink. It was waiting, not knowing what would happen, whether she was going to give birth in the bush, surrounded by a bunch of pretty mean men. But she learned something about waiting in that time. And in God's providence, she was freed and returned to the U.S. and gave birth there to her and her husband's son. So these promises come in a statement in verse 4, but they come, secondly, about the skies in verse 5. Then he brought him outside and said, "Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them." And he said to them, "So shall your descendants be." This is a new analogy that God is providing to help communicate what is going to happen to Abram. The earlier analogy was found in chapter 13 and verse 16. "And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered." Abram's descendants will be, according to this promise, first of all, numerous. And so we're not surprised when we come in the last book of the Bible to chapter 7 of Revelation and to verses 9 and 10. "After these things I looked," John is in a vision seeing heaven, "and behold," there's that word again, "a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" So Abram's descendants will be numerous, but they'll also be illustrious. They are going to be shining like the stars. And so in Philippians 2, verses 14 and 15, Paul describes God's people this way: "Do all things without complaining and disputing," as Abram needed to know, "that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault, in the midst of a crooked and wicked generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world." His descendants would not only be numerous, but they would be illustrious. They would be illuminating this world. They would also be legitimate. They would be legitimate. Romans 4:16. "Therefore it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law," that is, Jews, "but also to those who are the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all, Jews and Gentiles alike." And Abram's descendants will be believing as well. The last verses of Romans chapter 4. "Now it was not written for his sake alone that it was imputed to him." And we'll meet that word imputed later in our text. "But also for us, it shall be imputed to us who believe in him who raised up Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was delivered up because of our offenses and was raised because of our justification." Here we are reminded of our election in Jesus Christ, of our unconditional election, because Jesus has met all the conditions, not only for Abram, but for all his spiritual descendants. And the skies above on a clear night should be a reminder to us of that great fact, as it was to Abram every night for the rest of his life. These were the promises of God as the covenant makes progress in its revelation to us. There's further covenant progress in its reception in verse 6a. And he believed in the Lord. Remarkably, this is the first time in the Old Testament that we read of faith or belief. We could translate it literally, following some of the nuances of the Hebrew. He developed assurance in the Lord. He developed assurance in the Lord. Now that's very important because he didn't develop assurance in himself. He didn't develop assurance in something he did or said. He developed something in the Lord. And we see here a God-centered piety in Abram. And it's a reminder to us that our piety, our spiritual lives ought to be always focused on the Lord and not in some other direction. And so he developed assurance in the Lord and his promises. And as we'll see, as the accounting of Abram's life goes on, he continues to manifest his faith. Now, it's important that we understand that this faith is not simply a courageous attitude towards life. That's how some people talk about faith. Or it's that I have good morale, or that I have self-confidence, that I'm, going through life and everything is going well. No, that's not faith. Nor is it faith in faith, which a lot of so-called Christians have. They look on their faith as a work, as something they accomplished, as something that they did, as something meritorious in God's sight. It is not meriting anything at all. It is simply receiving the merit of Christ to us, to me. Faith is not faith in acts. Faith is in God and His covenant promises to us. And so, Abram is the father of those in the faith, as we read in Romans 4, is down through the millennia, challenging each of you to receive the promises of the covenant, to believe them, to obey them, to live in confidence in them. Because Jesus has come, He's done His work, and God has set His seal of approval upon Him by raising Him from the dead on the first day of the week, as Paul makes clear in Romans 4. Now, fifth and finally, in covenant progress, we look at its result in verse 6b. And He accounted it to him for righteousness. Righteousness is conformity to the moral requirements of God. Isn't that extraordinary? Abram did nothing but believe. And yet God, we read, believes that he is conformed to the moral requirements of God. How can that be? It is because we're talking not about a subjective reality, but an objective one. We're talking about a righteousness that is imputed to us, that is given to us, that is received by us, not because we are good, not because we are better, but because God has chosen us and has given this justification to us. This is the first time in the Old Testament that we read not only of faith, but also of righteousness, of a righteousness that is foreign to us and yet becomes ours, becomes personal, becomes transforming in our lives. This is the result of the covenant. And Abram is understanding more and more of it. God is helping him to understand that he is not righteous in himself, but he needs the righteousness of someone else, a substitute whose righteousness is great enough that it can cover all of Abram's sins. And God is pleased, much later in time and space, to provide that substitute. One day, Jesus would put himself in the place of all his own and atone for their sins. As we read in the Westminster Confession, chapter 11, section 1, which we'll be looking at, Lord willing, on Wednesday evening. Those whom God effectually calls, he also freely justifies, not by infusing righteousness into them. That's the Roman Catholic heresy. But by pardoning their sins and by accounting and accepting their persons as righteous, not for anything wrought in them or done by them, but for Christ's sake alone. Nor by imputing faith itself, the act of believing, or any other evangelical obedience to them as their righteousness, but by imputing the obedience and satisfaction of Christ unto them, they receiving and resting on him and his righteousness by faith, which faith they have not of themselves. It is the gift of God. There it's very plain, isn't it? Abram's faith was not the ground of his justification. It did not provide him righteousness. It was only God imputing that righteousness to him. Abram claimed that then future reality by faith. You must claim that now past reality by faith, because Jesus has come. And so you need to exercise faith in a substitute, one who is innocent and undefiled. As we read in Hebrews 7, verse 26 of him. For such a one was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and who has become higher than the heavens. So, Abram was justified by faith. And it's a reminder that God has always had only one means of justifying sinners in every age: faith in a substitute. Abram's case is a representative one. As Romans 4 makes plain, he is the father of those who are of faith. No matter your setting in life, after warfare, in transition, confused, despairing, struggling, God is calling you to respond to his covenantal urging and believe in the substitute whom God has provided. And once you've done that, to continue to respond in trust in him, not to begin to shift some of your trust upon yourself, upon your sanctification, but to continue to rest your confidence on the one who died for your sins and was raised for your justification. Then, and then only, will you be righteous in God's sight. And you can live in confidence that you benefit from the work of Jesus and can live at peace in this world of warfare and in peace with God. Let us pray.